Um, so the presentation today is really an exploration of a position. Maybe there's not a question that it'll end up with. There's probably a few of them running through it, and it's just really tried to make an elaboration about how to. I'm not certain about the title of this. It's sort of led things to an extent, but it might be something that would end up being revised at some point. I'm going to begin. There's kind of three sections in what I'll talk about. I'm going to talk through a diagram initially, which is sort of helped me. It's the thinking through of some ideas of Bernard Stiegler, Techniques and Time. And it's certainly kind of helped me as a sort of underpinning to approach some of these questions that we're having today, but specifically relationships of phenomenology and what Stiegler's thought does with phenomenology, the sort of steps it takes it in, which might make it quite clear, hopefully, what the relationship is to kind of material culture and things. There's also a kind of anecdotal level that's going to be in the presentation, and a sort of more theoretical sort of exposition. So I'm going to talk you through an interpretation of how phenomenology and DNA meet in a cultural prosthetic in Stiegler's Techniques and Time. So I'm going to spend maybe only 5 minutes on going through a diagram here, understanding certain backgrounds to some Husserlian notions of phenomenology, and then relate it to kind of some technobiological a technobiological space, or finding a meeting point between that sort of Husserlian phenomenology and the technobiologic. So if we begin with just sort of like, well, how might we think about what phenomenology is, then it's built up about how our attention is structured towards objects. Husserl breaks these down into basically the initial one being primary retention. This is the sort of thing about in a melody or in a sentence where you're remembering the last word that's been used to string together a sense of time and meaning, so that you're not always in this constant present. There's an immediate present that you're carrying through with you. There's also a sense of protension, which is just your anticipation that there is another word that will follow the one I'm doing now, that the melody makes sense by the note which hasn't yet occurred. Now, this is all described as a large now, or the comet's tail of nowness, I think is Husserl's actual term. So this is sort of Husserlian sort of idea about the sort of this present that we're in, which is a sort of expanded present. It's not just totally this moment, it's got a bit of before and it's got a bit of after in it. All kind of simple sort of idea, I guess. The next thing is the idea of a secondary retention, which is what we more commonly think about as memory. It's the things that happened yesterday, it's the things that happened years ago, it's things that we can bring back to recall to consciousness. It's a lived past. Now, what Stiegler does with this, sort of following Heidegger, is talks about the tertiary retention. So this is the third place of memory, and it's memory is existing in the inorganic supports. This could be archaeological artifacts. This could be documents. This could be. It's about the possibility of sort of exteriorization of the lived past into documents which become cross generations. So the transgenerational forms of memory. We start thinking about what on earth does this got to do with this, with biology? What has it got to do with other forms of memory? So the DNA, idea of DNA, the genetic memory of our species, the information contained at this level in the organism, is also kind of backed up by the notion of is countered or addressed as well within the idea of the individual experience. Each of us have different experiences, and this is called a sort of epigenetic thing. It's a memory which is stored in each of our nervous systems. So I have different kind of responses to events than anybody else because my experiences up to that point have all been different. So this is the type of level of experience which is, we can talk about maybe as being lost in animals. That there's no, because they don't have the tertiary retention, they don't have what is then actually sort of thought about as the epiphylogenetic. Now this word philo is really the idea of the ethnic group, so it's the way in which the individual nervous system puts itself into external objects, puts itself into the inorganic supports. It's how evolution might be occurring via this sort of cultural prosthetics. Now there's a hashed line through this, which is really because of, I think, as far as I understand the level of scientific research upon the relationships that might go on between the epigenetic and the genetic is, I think that the jury's out on this at the moment. But one starts to think about the sort of experiments that they're doing with mice, and that you put a mouse through a reward and punishment system, and it enforces certain behaviour. Now then they skip generations of doing this to the mice, and the mouse 5 generations down will behave as if it's had that reward and punishment system administered to it. It leaves open the question of, like, well, how has it received that memory which seems to start to all of a sudden suggest that the genetic memory of the species is more porous than being a sort of autonomous structure which individual experiences don't touch or alter. So you have that question then, really, which starts to sort of ask about whether there is any line that we can think about which moves through from the cultural prosthetic, from the inorganic supports, which might have a relevancy to even thinking about something like DNA. What we've got, I suppose, is a very technical space in the centre, and what we think about as biology in the bottom right there. 3 years ago, I had a tutorial with a student at a London art college. I'll call him Max. I arrived in Max's studio at the scheduled time and encountered a student sitting at a desk in front of a laptop. "Are you Max?" I asked hesitantly, considering I might be in the wrong room. "Yes," he replied awkwardly. "Are you sure?" I part joked, sensing his tension. "Yes, I am," Max confirmed. During this period of time, I was meeting many students in different art schools, often meeting 20 new faces a week, students that I would likely never see again. I could not remember their names. Often faces gave me only a glimmer of recognition. I intuited there was something not right about Max. I'd seen him in this college before, but couldn't bring to mind any information, and I brushed off my inability to finger the disquiet I felt. I took a seat, making an amount of small talk, aiming to build some trust between Max and myself. He wasn't helpful in this, something without which the tutorial would likely be unfruitful. I moved on, hoping we might find common ground if I was more direct. "Do you have any work to show me?" I was feeling some frustration. Max was reticent and wasn't making apparent what he would like to take from our encounter. Max wasn't going to give access to his current questions or concerns, and I braced myself for a potential slog over the next 45 minutes. He showed me a 4-minute video. I remember it as footage appropriated from the internet with a glitch-like gloss. It provoked some interest, but I required Max to open up and grant access to his decision-making and aspirations. I made some observations, but was reluctant to talk at him without knowing if I was communicating with him. I wouldn't talk for 45 minutes at someone I hadn't met before. I'd be unable to judge where to pitch a monologue. Power doesn't disintegrate in tutorials, but they require reciprocation, particularly on a first meeting. I moved into the detective role. What did he want to get out of this? Slightly interrogatively. I watched a video game, asked more questions, gave some observations, which were aiming to become provocative. He had nothing to say, appearing distant from and unconcerned with his own work. My questions made him uncomfortable. He was evasive. He tried to repress his discomfort, and I tried to control my exasperation. He was intelligent and confident, but had no commitment to taking part in our process. This went on for 20 minutes. Max couldn't stand this any longer, and my initial disquiet became understandable. Max told me that he wasn't Max, but Bob. I recalled his name, and Bob's face fell into place. The week before, I'd had a tutorial with Bob. And Bob continued. Max was in the library. Max was writing what he imagined was happening in this tutorial. Bob, I had a tutorial with you last week. Surely you imagine I would likely remember, I said. Yes, replied Bob. Max had employed an actor, but the actor phoned this morning saying he was ill. An hour ago, Max asked if I would stand in. I was exasperated by this situation. I don't really have anything else to say, I stated, stood up, and left. It wasn't so much that I felt I'd been cheated, more why would I talk to the monkey, not the organ grinder? 2 hours later, Max sent an apologetic email. I replied courteously, but with a degree of flippancy, and cautious not to play the roles of challenged authority or beneficiary of his regret, roles I felt that were being thrust upon me. Max had left me with a knot. Much of what's going to follow now in this talk is stimulated by Mario Perniola's book Art and Its Shadow. And Perniola draws a distinction between two ingenuities of contemporary art. Two ingenuities that he claims reduce the problematic of art to two banalities. The first ingenuity that gains its fanatics is that artworks are essential to art. The artwork is an immobile centre around which mediations circulate. The critics, curators, and theorists' mediations are secondary, derivative. Even the artist is incidental. It is a viewpoint positioned in ownership, whether authorial or of the collector. Its function creates the conditions for possession, leaving aside the conditions that make the existence of the artwork and the category of art possible. It resolves this problematic by inflating the object relics of art. To critics of this viewpoint, these artworks are fetish objects. Perniola's opposing ingenuity, or banality, finds the essentialness of art in the effectiveness of its communicative capacity. Here, art is in direct competition with mass communication and advertising, and its aim is the resolution of art in life. There is no specificity to art in this view. Rather, art's essentialness exists in its immediate communication to a subject. Artworks are parasitic surpluses. As a view of art, it leaves aside the thickness and complexity of the real, resolving itself in a transparency without any mediations. To critics of this view, immediate communication manifests a tenuous vitalism. There are two errors often encountered in arts education that find some reflection in Perniola's banalities. The first concerns subjectivity and judgment. It's quite frequent to encounter the concern voiced by students that all interpretation is subjective. Everyone has a viewpoint, one student says, aiming to shrug off the import of and responsibility within the process of talking about the experiences of looking, reading, deciphering. What the student implies but doesn't say is we're all capable of judgment. The point at which we have a viewpoint is the point at which we can make judgments. And this student fears that the viewpoints, because multiple, do not address his work. The student is correct in describing judgments, but missed the point of the discussion. The crit and tutorial situation doesn't resolve itself by voicing judgments. A central dynamic in Christoph Menck's The Aesthetic Critique of Judgment from 2010 concerns the distinction between method and judgment. For Menck, method in an aesthetic critique relies upon the suspension of judgment. Judgment occurs as a flash, whereas method proceeds in steps without the guaranteed terminus of judging. For Menck, The process of critiquing work is to understand how a judgment comes to be formed. In critique, judgment is less important than the social processes of affirmation, negation, agreement and opposition. The critique of art is a social method occurring across individuals in which the question is, how can judgment be formed? The unfolding method must stay close to objects whilst judgments occur in subjects. The student who says everyone has a viewpoint is willing his work to become an artifact left behind in a social process. But worse, a leftover that hasn't played a role in a social process. The multiplication of viewpoints, of which she speaks, fragments the social process into atomistic subjectivities. We all have a viewpoint makes the artifact and the social process irrelevant at one and the same moment. The viewpoints this student speaks about fail to engage things, they only engage judgments. The second error experience also finds reflection in Perniola's assessment is the self-evidency of the work. It is common in crits and tutorials to encounter an opposite, often not openly stated belief, that the artwork is self-evident. The student situated in this belief is equally indifferent to social mediation, not because of the fragmentation of viewpoints, but for the opposite reason. Their work and others succeeds or fails if it communicates directly. There is something to be understood from their work, as if the work begins a journey with a message that its social existence neither pollutes or changes. Nothing of the work is revealed by a social process. On one side, all interpretation is subjective, and on the other, the artwork is self-evident. On one side, an excess of mediators, and on the other, their absence. The aim of crits and tutorials works against these two errors. Both arts education and Perniola position themselves prior to his assessment of two militancies. There should be a skillful negotiation that maintains the existence of art's problematic. Students are taught activities of making and encouraged to discursively mediate what they are doing whilst making. Students are structured so they can position themselves within a bifurcation of material and semiotic moments. Within this bifurcation, a single logic is attempted, a field called art. Educators involve students in social processes, introducing staged places of reflection. A crit is a preliminary instruction for further consideration. Its purpose is what is called propedeutic. The crit is propedeutic in the role of social processes in constructing works, and conversely, the role of the work in constructing social processes. Art education maintains this forked path, a junction that is ambivalent towards valorizing either works or mediation. The primacy of objects is not upheld, nor is their social articulation. Unlike the social process of critique, centered upon mediating and teasing out objects' differences, judgment is the force of subjects. For Menck, judgments are distinctions of value. Judgments do not say how things are, but how they are in relation to us, to subjects. The judgments of a subject can become rationalized. Though reasoning a judgment requires no extra thought of that object that has caused it, only an extension of the initial judgment. The judgment has the stony quality of an artifact, an internal relic whose reasoning is its reliquary. In rationalizing a judgment, a subject is always catching up, assimilating and aiming to render the judgment back to itself. It thwarts a process of incorporation, of bringing objects inside. It is because of this that for Menck, judgment is not determined by a subject, but is the determination of a subject. Menck goes further. Judgment's character as force extends artistic activity. Judgment is continuous with the aesthetic act. Menck writes, an aesthetic judgment on an aesthetic object is a move in an aesthetic act. If we are to follow Menck's logic, though he doesn't state this, then a work is already a judgment. Methodically following objects allows no judgment to arise. Judging objects as an extension of the aesthetic field allows no method. Yet, following Menk's logic, the artwork is already a judgment. He acknowledges the paradox revealed. Within the paradox he unfolds lies Perniola's thingness, a quality that advances and retreats, part object and part subject, a suspension. Things, unlike objects, press against us. We employ social processes to disentangle ourselves from this stickiness of things, turning things into objects, works, relics, artifacts. In opposing judgment and method, art gains a particular and complex relationship to methodology. Art does not escape taste. Taste is judgment. It may, however, escape knowledge, as it oscillates between the internal relic of judgment and the infinity of social processes. It constructs this escape by articulating objects into things. In the staged social processes of art education, if we begin with works, the aim is to render them things. If we begin with things, the aim is to articulate their alterity from within a social process that renders them alien and internal at the same time, because the thing is a quasi-object, a quasi-subject that is endlessly intervening and innovating. I've decided to take the situation with Bob and Max seriously and see beyond a juvenile affront to tutorial authority. Max's flawed work produced a knot, including my decision to depart. I expected to discuss Max's work, the objects he makes. Bob and I tried to discuss Max's video. I hoped to enable a conversation through steps of understanding how we might arrive at a judgment, some temporary conclusion. But Bob could not make the video discursively porous. Ultimately, the video revealed itself as a decoy duck. The work encompassed Bob, who knew this, and me, who didn't. With good faith, I'd walked into Max's trap. I was the stooge of the situation, a role I didn't want to prolong. I might have castigated Bob for lying and conceding to his friend's deceitful instruction. But I didn't want to articulate myself as an injured party. And Bob's embarrassment was palpable. I felt sorry for him, holding the front line, whilst Max enjoyed sadistic and Machiavellian dreams in the library. Max was the puppeteer of the deformed situation. Max had taken duplicitous control of the social process, but he had Bob be the one who lied. There is some cowardice here, and this is important as I mediate this event. Max's cowardice allowed him to gain a spurious vitality, imagination, and freedom, dreaming in the library, whilst Bob and I were stuck in lies and falsity, an inorganic, because technical, mix of poor performances and artifice. Max's ingenuity imposed a certain objecthood upon Bob and myself, where thingliness became out of our grasp. The social process was stifled. Neither Bob nor I had space for manoeuvre. The original aim of having an actor deceive me may have calcified the situation into a work. Instead, under Max's instruction, Bob had produced this deformed situation, a morally viscous and sticky situation, a failed work containing one unwilling and one unwitting participant. A quasi-object compromised both Bob and myself. The judgment to leave Max's studio was already trumped by his own judgment to be absent. His apology retracted this judgment. Perhaps there was a failure in this. He quickly removed my possibility of injury. The apology allows me to now appropriate his judgments and determine the contours of the resulting knot. Now that I'm incorporating Max's imposed objecthood, that I'm trying to trace, with some method, the knotty condition it had produced, not to unravel it, but to incorporate it as a deformed object, a thing open to incorporation. I've lost the next image, but this is a flag I recognise. It strikes me with the force of an object, not the enigma of a thing. It communicates directly if it operates effectively. It aims to centre a symbolic community. It is a sign requiring immediate judgment and the production of identity. I feel the pressure to judge. How to render this symbol with viscosity, to retard its demand. The flag of Europe is the flag of Our Lady, said Arsène Heitz in 1987 of the flag he designed in 1955. This object demanding immediate judgment, i.e. the determination of a subject, thickens when we understand it as a reworking of the Madonna's halo, which is the missing slide. Is this knowledge of the Madonna's halo working secretly within the flag important? What judgment does it force? What determination of a subject will it now impose? Here, I am not mobilising conspiracy theory, which would sanction only alternate judgments, but that this splitting of the sign into the European community and the Madonna's halo dislodges my subjectivity and certainty that I might have had in judgment. It might allow the determination by a subject. In this manner, the crit and tutorial through the method of suspending judgment is important. That is, the propedeutic purpose is to render as a thing, producing viscosity in the inorganic and retarding the vital, mobilising the artefact's rigor mortis whilst thickening social processes. The social process here is not one of removing us from the inorganic as a vitalist project of immediate communication would, but one of incorporating the inorganic, the unpatrollable borders of the thing. Thank you.